The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, A History of Nazi Germany. Written by William L. Shirer. Introduction. Inside the Heart of Darkness.
The rise of Adolf Hitler and the totalitarian machinery of Nazi Germany was not an accident of history, nor the product of a single madman's ambition. It was a calculated convergence of political instability, propaganda mastery, social resentment, and unchecked power. At its core, it was a story of a modern nation, rich in culture and intellect, surrendering its soul to a ruthless ideology. Drawing from his own experiences as a foreign correspondent in the 1930s Berlin and from thousands of official documents uncovered after the war, William L. Shirer presents not just a historical account but a staggering insider chronicle of how a civilized society descended into barbarism, from Hitler's obscure beginnings to the apocalyptic collapse of the Third Reich. This is a chronicle of ambition, manipulation, and destruction on a scale that still echoes today. The story unfolds not only in battlefields and speeches, but in boardrooms, courtrooms, secret police files, and whispered betrayals. It is here, in the shadows of power and the silence of bystanders, that the true architecture of tyranny becomes visible. What rises from the ashes of Weimar is not only a dictator but a mirror, reflecting the dangers that await any society when fear is weaponized and truth is sacrificed at the altar of power.
Seeds of Catastrophe. The Collapse of the Weimar Republic.
Germany's defeat in the First World War did not end on the battlefield. It echoed through every corner of its fractured society. The Treaty of Versailles, with its humiliating reparations and territorial losses, sowed resentment across the population. The democratic experiment known as the Weimar Republic was born in this climate, brave in its ideals, yet unstable in its foundation. Inflation spiraled out of control. Political violence became commonplace. Extremist ideologies flourished. Into this chaos stepped a man of little formal education but deep instinct for public sentiment. Adolf Hitler, a former soldier turned political agitator, found his voice in the beer halls of Munich and his calling in the pages of Mein Kampf. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the anger simmering beneath Germany's defeat. The narrative he crafted was intoxicating. Germany had not lost the war on the field, but had been betrayed from within by communists, Jews, and corrupt elites. It was a myth, but a potent one. The Nazi Party was not taken seriously at first. It seemed fringe, even farcical. But as the Weimar government stumbled from one crisis to another, Hitler's movement began to grow. Each street clash, each failed coalition, pushed ordinary Germans closer to the simplicity of authoritarian solutions. Democracy, to many, seemed a failed experiment. By the early 1930s, the Nazis were no longer outsiders. They were a political force, and Hitler, through both violence and electoral strategy, was on the verge of power. What followed was not a revolution, it was a surrender.
From Chancellor to Führer, the legal seizure of power.
January 30th, 1933, marked the turning point. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. To many observers, this was a compromise move, a way to contain the radicals by bringing them into the system. But Hitler had no intention of being contained. Within weeks, the Reichstag building went up in flames, and with it, the last fragile protections of the democratic state. The fire was blamed on communists, and the resulting decree suspended civil liberties across the country. The Enabling Act followed swiftly, giving Hitler's cabinet full legislative powers. In less than 2 months, he had turned the republic into a dictatorship, legally, efficiently, and without a single shot fired. What followed was a breathtaking consolidation of power. Opposition parties were banned, trade unions dissolved, regional governments were dismantled. The SA and SS, paramilitary wings of the Nazi Party, terrorized dissenters while swearing loyalty not to Germany, but to Hitler personally. The press became a tool of propaganda. The courts, once guardians of justice, were twisted into enforcers of ideology. Perhaps the most chilling part of this transformation was how easily it happened. Many Germans welcomed it. Order had returned. Jobs were being created. Pride was being restored. Resistance was scattered, demoralized, and ultimately crushed. The mask of legitimacy concealed the machinery of oppression. What emerged was not just a dictatorship, it was a cult of personality, a nation where one man's will became law and his word sacred.
Building the total state, indoctrination, terror, and obedience.
The Nazi regime's control extended far beyond politics. It sought to mold the very consciousness of the German people. Schools were transformed into ideological training grounds. Children learned loyalty not to their families or communities, but to the Führer. Textbooks were rewritten. Teachers who resisted were removed. The Hitler Youth replaced independent youth organizations, instilling nationalism and militarism from an early age. The arts, science, and religion were all brought into alignment with the regime's goals. Books were burned. Degenerate artists were silenced. Clergy who spoke out faced imprisonment or worse. A new vocabulary took root, one that erased individuality, discouraged critical thought, and glorified the state. Fear became a daily companion. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, maintained a vast network of informants. A careless comment could result in interrogation, torture, or disappearance. Citizens learned to guard their speech, distrust their neighbors, and obey without question. But terror alone did not hold the Reich together. There was also seduction, spectacular rallies in Nuremberg, choreographed pageantry, and Hitler's mesmerizing oratory created a sense of unity and destiny. The promise was grand. Germany would rise again, and its enemies would be vanquished. For many, it was enough to look the other way. The result was a society where evil could be committed not just by monsters, but by ordinary men and women, each playing a role, each convinced of their righteousness, or too afraid to resist.
The machinery of conquest, from diplomacy to blitzkrieg.
Having secured total control at home, Hitler turned his eyes outward. But conquest did not begin with tanks. It began with treaties. Repeatedly, Hitler promised peace while preparing for war. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, and the absorption of Czechoslovakia all occurred with minimal resistance from Western democracies still haunted by World War I. These early successes emboldened him. The military, initially wary, began to trust his instincts. Industrialists grew rich from rearmament. The German people, fed a steady diet of victories and propaganda, celebrated the restoration of national pride. But Poland changed everything. On September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, combined speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. Cities fell in days. Resistance was crushed. Britain and France, finally realizing the futility of appeasement, declared war. World War II had begun. Germany's early campaigns were stunning in their efficiency. Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, and France fell in rapid succession. Hitler was hailed as a genius. The Nazi Empire now stretched across most of Europe. But behind the military triumphs lay something darker: the systematic targeting of populations, the exploitation of conquered peoples, and the early stages of industrialized murder. Victory bred overreach, and Hitler, consumed by his own myth, turned east toward the Soviet Union, believing he could destroy it in weeks. That decision would become the beginning of the end.
The Holocaust, bureaucracy, and blood.
While military campaigns unfolded on one front, another operation, quieter, more methodical, infinitely more horrific, was underway. The persecution of Jews, long a feature of Nazi rhetoric and policy, now evolved into a systematic plan for annihilation. The ghettos of Eastern Europe became holding pens. Starvation, disease, and violence were routine. But even this was deemed too slow. The Wannsee Conference of 1942 marked the turning point. the final solution was formalized. Industrial killing centers, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, were constructed with chilling efficiency. Gas chambers, crematoria, transport schedules, all meticulously organized by bureaucrats, engineers, and logisticians. What made the Holocaust particularly terrifying was not just the scale, it was the ordinariness of its execution. Middle managers filed reports. Guards followed orders. Doctors experimented on children. The machinery of genocide operated under the guise of law and necessity. 6 million Jews perished. Alongside them, millions of Roma, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others deemed unworthy of life. The world would only begin to grasp the full horror when the camps were liberated in 1945. But by then, the damage was almost complete. The Holocaust was not an aberration. It was the logical culmination of a regime built on dehumanization, racial purity, and obedience. It remains the central moral indictment of the Nazi era.
Collapse and reckoning, the fall of the Third Reich.
By 1943, the tide of war had turned. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. Allied bombing campaigns devastated German cities. The invasion of Italy and the D-Day landings brought the war to Germany's doorstep. Inside the Reich, cracks began to show. Assassination plots against Hitler emerged. Generals grew skeptical. Civilians, once jubilant, now lived in fear of air raids and Soviet vengeance. The fantasy of eternal victory collapsed under the weight of reality. Hitler, increasingly isolated and paranoid, retreated into his bunker. As Allied forces closed in from both east and west, he ordered a scorched earth policy: destroy everything, leave nothing for the enemy. Few followed this final madness. On April 30th, 1945, with Berlin in ruins and his dream in ashes, Hitler took his own life. The Third Reich surrendered days later. What remained was rubble, physical, moral, and spiritual. The post-war trials at Nuremberg attempted to deliver justice. But many questions remained. How could this happen? Why did so many obey? And what warnings does this history offer future generations?
Conclusion: the anatomy of tyranny.
The story of the Third Reich is not confined to the past. It is a lesson encoded in the DNA of the modern world. It shows how democracies can collapse not with a coup, but with applause. How truth can be drowned in spectacle. How ordinary people faced with fear and offered certainty can embrace unspeakable cruelty. What makes this narrative urgent is its familiarity. The mechanisms of manipulation, the exploitation of crisis, the creation of scapegoats, these are not relics. They are possibilities, always waiting in the margins. By documenting this descent from democracy to dictatorship, from idealism to atrocity, the story serves as both record and warning. It reminds us that evil is not only about monsters, it is about systems, silence, and the choices we make when faced with injustice. To study this rise and fall is not just to understand history. It is to understand ourselves.
Thanks for listening. Did you enjoy this book summary? Got ideas on how we can make it even better? Drop us a quick note. We're always listening and learning from you.